Welcome back everyone. Today we have another exciting early access video of City Skylines 2. Over the last couple of videos we've been establishing what started as a town and slowly transforming it into a city. And today will be a continuation of our first two videos. We're going to be expanding our city while looking at more of what City Skylines 2 has to offer. So if you are new to the channel, be sure to hit the subscribe button, leave a like, and drop a comment down below with any questions you may have, although because it is early access, I may be limited on what I can say or answer. And keep in mind, because this is early access, this is not the final release version of the game. And I've got to say thank you to all our recent subscribers since these videos have been releasing, and I hope you're looking forward to more content on the channel. But with all that out of the way, let's get started. Thankfully, we have a longer video that we can output today because we have a lot to accomplish. I really want to do a drastic expansion on the city in multiple directions, but there are some mistakes that I've made along the way. At the end of recording our last episode, I noticed that our demand had really shrunk. There was a heavy focus on low-density residential and industrial with minimal demand for anything else. At first I thought maybe it was taxes, but then I started to look a little bit deeper, and two of the things that are very heavy indicators of what's going on are education level and wealth. So education is broken up into multiple tiers, all the way from elementary school, high school, college, and university. And I hadn't really advanced beyond placing a high school down, so we have some room to grow in the education area. So with our expansion, we're going to be focused on education and first of all adding a college. And then we're also going to incentivize folks to try to get a higher education by lowering taxes for well-educated workers or residents. Now you could balance this better early on and not have to incentivize it as much as I am, but I'm really looking to sort of jumpstart the situation. In addition to messing with some of the residential taxes, I'm also going to try to incentivize things like office space and commercial space. It seems it's easy to get caught in a scenario where if you don't keep up with certain things, you're going to get demand focused in only a couple of areas, which could limit your ability to really build a city that you're looking to build. Now, I'm not sure if some of this is just how the gameplay operates or if some of it is a balancing issue, because I've seen a couple of things. For example, one other side of it is that as I'm placing all this low density residential with the demand that exists, I'm also seeing a tendency for them to complain about high rent. But while they're complaining about high rent and the suggestion then is to up the density to a different tier, they're also abandoning downtown. And from what I've seen is this low density demand for residential is never ending. As much as I put down, they will still request more and minimally of anything else. And like I said, if we continue on this path, they may not want to live in downtown either, so buildings will begin to go abandoned, which begs the question, what's going on with the high rent situation? I think there may be some tweaking that needs to happen on the back end to polish out this experience, because I haven't been able to find great ways to address it. Now, while we continue to expand, you're going to see some advances in time, and now we are in the winter months, so you're going to see a little bit of a color temperature change. We now have a little bit more of a desaturated blue look than the sort of warmer look we had in autumn. I will say the first time I noticed this, I was a little surprised. I thought I'd actually changed the setting because it is quite dreary. So in addition to expanding on the north side of the highway, I'm going to go ahead and clear an area on the south side of the highway to continue that expansion. Now, there's also going to be a whole nother phase that we're going to do on the entire other side of downtown, which you'll see in a little bit. But to cover the sort of demand that we're going to be facing here shortly, I need a lot of room to grow. And the sort of demand we're going to witness here shortly is going to be significant enough that we're going to have to expand pretty quickly. So as I talked about in our last episode of Early Access, the scale in Cities 2, again, is pretty different. And what I've noticed is that there is indeed a sprawl that you begin to create because of how demand operates. And because the scaling is different, I found myself basically painting certain zones into large areas and letting them slowly fill up. And the game is pretty good about identifying areas that you've already placed and needing to fill them up as demand comes up. That's not really a surprise, though I think Cities 1 was pretty decent at that as well. Now you can see that we're already starting to gain office demand when one thing we need to keep up with is being able to apply certain buildings and services as needed as we grow. One thing I haven't placed yet is a welfare office, which boosts well-being in neighborhoods around the building. So we're going to place that a little bit more centralized and then continue to expand this area of our expansion with low density residential. Because as you can see, we have 100% low density residential demand. And you may notice that nothing has drastically changed on our demand meter with the exception of offices, and that could just be a reflection of taxes being lowered, because our education plan is going to take some time to develop. But I think the folks that play City Skylines mainly for simulation will actually be really stoked to see this, because there seems to be real consequences to not focusing on certain things like education, and it'll affect what you're able to do or how you're able to build your city, because demand may or may not be there for certain things. None of this should really be that surprising, but I do think the calculations that Cities 2 makes are much more robust. We've talked a little bit about that before, that there seems to be a lot more happening in the background, giving your city much more life and a little bit more of a sort of growth pattern. There's something to be said about how much life sort of exists within Cities 2. It does feel like the city is growing. And it's not limited to one area. There are multiple factors at play that make it feel like there are things that you need to do to manage the city versus just plopping down and moving on. Now, if you're someone that enjoys the aesthetic side of building a city, you may find some challenges in this when you just want to break or you just want to, decorate. Whereas the simulation side will probably rejoice because I think there is a lot to do to balance your city. That's not to say that you don't get to a point where you can sort of plateau in terms of, hey, I'm making enough money, I've got basic services covered. You can definitely hit that point to some degree, but I've never felt in a situation where there wasn't some demand or possibility to continue growing the city. Some buildings, along with monthly service fees, can get overwhelming and can eat chunks out of your budget. Thankfully, with milestones, you can get little bursts of income that can help you along the way, but there are definitely times where you can hit a little bit of an issue if you start placing down services and other buildings that require monthly upkeeps that are pretty pricey. It can really affect your budget. So as we zoom out, you can see how much we've grown. I haven't paid a ton of attention to the industrial side of what's going on right now. I know it's functional and it's working, and we don't have a ton of demand for more industrial, so I'm not too stressed about it. Our focus is largely, at least for the first part of this episode, going to be on just trying to maintain residential and services. It's not terribly difficult to get to a point where you just don't have enough services from one or two buildings. You may have to use that modular side of buildings to increase capacity. That's something that I kind of was forgetting about on certain buildings, or I thought I had done, and I ended up going back and adding some of the modular pieces to buildings to continue to be able to handle the influx of new sims. So we're going to go ahead and continue to expand the city over in this direction, south of the highway. And this is primarily going to be around residential and commercial expansion, not so much focused on anything else. And then we'll probably add some education in here later as this area develops. I'd like this to almost be a little bit of a town away from the city. So that might be something we encourage by placing certain zones later on. Now, there's a couple of tendencies I found with zoning. I don't really like placing a lot of commercial back to back. I like to kind of set them up where the commercial is on a main road and something else is behind it. That can be an office or residential. I think the commercial back to back looks a little bit goofy at times, then maybe that's just a personal preference. In addition to some of the low density commercial, I've also been adding offices, so I'll almost switch back and forth just to get a little bit more of a diverse layout in terms of what buildings are showing up on certain roads, especially main avenues. So we're starting to see more college students in town. Our elementary school's about full. We're having a little bit of a delay on any growth in the high school area. That may be tax related. It's not something I'm too concerned about because they are going to college. But it does take several months for folks to graduate from college, and they can drop out. So you need to make sure that certain things are maintained to promote efficiency within your college. There are modular aspects to the buildings, and there's going to be a building later, I think, that pops up that gives us a little bit more of an efficiency boost. So I'm going to adjust some taxes and try to, again, incentivize folks to go to school so that we can hopefully get the burst of growth that we want to see. We're starting to see a little bit of commercial demand, so I'm going to go ahead and try to make sure we accommodate that, get some more businesses going in here, as well as continue to support our office demand, which has grown quite extensively. And we continue to unlock some signature buildings. I think I have 2 signature buildings that I need to place. This building's actually really cool. I love that the signature buildings have a much different purpose and they seem like there's a lot of value added to them. This is considered an office building, but it's going to do a lot for our city. Right off the bat, it's going to help with education by giving certain boosts. It's going to increase office efficiency and reduce crime rate while boosting well-being in the area. And you may have noticed that some of these buffs are actually citywide and some of them are within a certain radius around the building, so you need to keep that in mind while you're placing these. And while we're setting that up, I've noticed that we now have high density residential demand skyrocketing from what it was, which was non-existent. So I have some idea of what to expect here. This is going to create some pretty tall buildings. We need to spread this out a little bit. Stacking them too close together didn't look as good as kind of spreading them out and giving them some space to live. So I'm going to go ahead and zone a couple of spots in here in our downtown area, and you're going to see what this creates beyond just this massive crane. But this is going to massively change our skyline as we continue to grow this city. And without much of a wait, you're going to see our first skyscraper. Our first high density residential building is complete, and you're going to see it towering above a lot of the medium density. Now, not all of the high density residential buildings are going to be this tall, but it does give us a skyline above what we had. And I think intermixing these buildings into this area are going to look really nice. And you can see the building looks pretty cool. So we're going to go and start buying property on this side of town, which is going to be another portion of our expansion plan, moving onto these islands. You can see I've left a lot of these roads available to extend from the downtown over, and this will be something we work on as we progress through the video. One thing I will admit that when doing bridges or crossing waterways, I've noticed some finicky aspects to road building. I think this is something that needs a little bit of work, a little bit of polish, and it'll work a little bit better. But there are times where I'm trying to build a bridge over water and it tells me that I'm building it in the water. Like it's giving me an indicator of some sort of overlap over water, and that's kind of goofy considering it should know what I'm doing, given how intuitive some of these controls are. And some of this may be because of where it's predicting the terrain to be on the other side. Like it's saying it's too low still to the water, even though you're clearly putting it on the ground. Sometimes it's fixed just by doing some adjustments to terrain. It's also important to keep tabs on how much you're maybe elevating the road, because sometimes you can end up with bumpy bridges. That's something I've had to be careful with. I'll actually up the road in the middle and I need to drop it at the other end. That might be self-explanatory to some. For me, it was kind of throwing me off depending on the height or the situation that I was in. For example, here with crossing this island and then going over, I need to lower the elevation one step down so that it lands where I need it to land in terms of its height on the other side. You can actually use the bridge tool to go ahead and draw it. I'm going to upgrade this. I found some mixed results on upgrading or using the tool. It can sometimes just not be as even as I want it to be. So you need to be careful how your sort of nodes are placed in a way to keep it sort of balanced, especially if you're somebody that wants those sections of the bridge to be pretty even. I think one area of feedback I would offer is that in some situations, the overlap tool just needs to be toned down a little bit. You need a little bit more flexibility. This is something you'll often see when doing like some detail work. If you're adding trees to an area, you get a lot of overlap indications if you're too close to buildings, and it can be hard to fit trees in between some buildings, even when you think there is space. Now, some of that may be because you're looking at a tree that hasn't grown up yet, right? So it's telling you by the time the tree grows up, it won't be able to fit in that space, and that's fine. But it's also an argument for maybe being able to place fully grown trees in some situations so we can actually see what it's going to look like. Because right now, since the trees grow, I can't see what the fully developed tree is going to look like unless I find it on the map, which, okay, sure, that's a workaround, but still, it'd be nice to be able to place fully grown trees in certain areas where you want the detailing to be complete. I don't think this has to be an across-board change. It might just be something to incorporate an option where you can place a fully grown tree. So next up, I want to look at parks, and I want to look at large sports parks. We've taken a little bit of a peek at some of your park options. I've added a couple in the town, but now I want to go ahead and actually use development points to unlock large sports parks, and we're going to place a couple down in the city. These aren't overly massive, but one is a soccer field, which is pretty cool. You can add that in. You also get a community pool and a football field. Now, at first I was thinking these might be stadiums. They don't really give that vibe, especially in comparison to what we had towards the end of the DLCs and content creator packs for Cities 1, where we got actual stadiums that we could place throughout our city. But these lean more into being parks. Now, a couple of these might give you a nice community area, but we're still missing stadiums from what we can build in the city as far as I know. But I do feel like having a tab for large sports parks gives opportunity to continue to add stuff to the game that fit that category. Although I do hope they clean the pool, or maybe it's just out of season, but brown water isn't exactly inviting. But hopefully placing these will help with well-being and also provide some attractiveness to certain areas. Now, in a brief period that I wasn't recording, because we're on 3-speed, we suddenly accumulated snow. So here we are, this is what full-on winter looks like. We're currently in February, and as you can see, it's -1 degree Celsius. So here we are in our winter wonderland, although it won't last too long because, again, we are in 3-speed as we try to continue to grow the city and expand. And I am trying to hit the next milestone sooner than later. So something we're going to be a little bit more focused on moving forward is starting to set up these districts and making sure certain services are working in certain districts. Now, I'm not going to be over the top about it, but I do want to get these in place so that we can try to help manage our services and allocation better. It can be difficult for your services to keep up with your growth, so you may have to set boundaries for them to operate, and that's something we'll be doing as we move forward, depending on the location. And since we're expanding in 2 different directions, I think it's pretty easy to divide up things. And keep in mind, you can select multiple districts for certain services to work in, so they don't have to be limited to just one district. You can set them up and they can function in multiple or all of them depending on what you pick. You can also see the sort of expansion we're doing to downtown within the island, which is primarily going to be larger buildings. So we're going to be mixing high density residential and some different mixed use space and commercial space into that area. But we're about to unlock some things that I'm going to show you in a second, which are going to be really, really helpful for sort of making really dense downtowns. So while I may have missed the snow accumulating, we do get to see the snow slowly receding away as we enter, I guess, the later stages of February. I'll be interested to see if some of these weather patterns are dynamic in any way. Do they sort of adjust depending on the year? How complicated is the weather? Because that's something I really haven't looked at very far, but it'd be neat to see some changes to that. Maybe it snows in December instead of February or something along those lines. I also thought snow might last a little bit longer. Like I thought it might show up in December and last through February, but we did get a quick look at it, so that's cool. And now we finally hit our milestone number 9, Great Town, which is going to reward us with some cash, development points, and some more expansion points. And of course, it unlocks high density commercial space, which is probably one of my favorite zoning types in Cities 2. And like we've done with some of our more recent zoning, I'm going to sort of patch these in certain places and mix up some of our zones between high density residential and some of the medium density residential. I think that'll help create a little bit of diversity in some of the building selection and also make the town look a little bit more alive instead of just looking like I just zoned a bunch of medium density, which I did, but now I'm trying to cover it up. Now, I also like the mixed use, and for the most part, I've seen that blend really well in downtown areas. It looks dense and pretty lively, so I think this in combination with the high density commercial will create some really cool downtown spaces. This is a huge benefit on CS2 over CS1 because you do have opportunities to make really dense and lively looking downtowns with a variety of buildings and zoning types you can use. Additionally, you can work on areas that feel like a proper fade from a low density area into downtown. As you begin to city build, I think you're going to see really cool opportunities to blend in different towns and different areas of your maps. And something we haven't really explored here is setting up different cities within the same map where we unlock tiles in different places, but you can imagine how that's going to work given what we've set up. Now, I do think Cities 2 lends itself to having areas develop over time, so it may be something where you place a bunch of low density residential, and over time you begin to see the area as something that needs to shift into more medium density or high density as your city progresses. And I think this is where some of the high rent notifications come in, but we'll take a look at that a little bit later, because we have a new signature building, which is an apartment building. Now, this doesn't necessarily fit my city maybe the way I would hope, but we're going to go ahead and place it in so we can have it boost the well-being of folks within 2 kilometers. But I'm going to go ahead and place it in our downtown area just to boost the well-being in this space because we do have some other things boosting well-being elsewhere. Now, as we pan back over to this part of the expansion, you can see some of the high-density commercial actually coming in. And I think this works perfectly for this area. You might be able to tell why I like it because it gives you some variety on top of medium density residential and mixed use. It sort of fits the same vibe. Mixing these type of buildings with towers and skyscrapers, I think is going to come out pretty good. It's going to give us a nice density while not having buildings that are massive be next to buildings that are way too short. So you can see demand is leveled out. We've hit some milestones. So let's spend some development points because we have a pretty decent income. I think we can afford a couple of buildings in the long run. One of those buildings we might get is the City Hall because that is actually going to offer some efficiencies if we need it, but it'll also lower some of the cost of imported goods, which would be helpful because we're importing quite a bit. There's also plenty of buildings we should probably unlock, like a fire station, so we have a little more capacity. We could go ahead and unlock a university, which gives us a whole nother layer to our education system. But as I mentioned in the previous videos, a lot of this is going to depend on what you want to focus on because there's buildings that you have to unlock other buildings. It is a true tech tree. And since I'm still learning how to play the game, I tend to save just a few points so that I can unlock certain things. For example, a power station might be necessary as the city grows and can be more efficient than running multiple of the same power plant. But since we've had a pretty good effect on our demand, we're going to go ahead and unlock the university, which will give us again another layer to our education and hopefully continue to push some of these other densities of zones. And we're also going to unlock the city hall because we do have a lot of stuff being imported because we really haven't focused on specialized industry, at least as of yet, because I think that's going to be something we add in a little bit more later. And we start to look a little bit at how having some of that specialized industry is going to affect our overall city and the economy. Now, I've noticed that several buildings that you're going to place down have a little bit of a campus. And I'm a little bit mixed on that only because the campuses tend to look rather similar to the other campuses. So, for example, the city hall is going to have a campus area. This building is going to take up a large chunk of the city block. I kind of wish you could get the building separate of the campus in some instances to add a little bit of variety so that you didn't have the same layout, like in terms of the pathing and stuff around the building. I also don't know if this city hall really fits fully with the North American theme. It still feels a little bit European more so to me, but that's just my opinion. Now, something I've turned off at the very beginning of playing Cities 2 was the Chirper notifications, but sometimes it helps to go check out what they're asking for on occasion just to get a feel for what may be going on in the city that you're not necessarily aware of. They will talk a lot about healthcare and noise, something we're probably pretty familiar with that Sims will complain about. But every so often you may get a reminder of something you need to do, maybe like adding more radio towers to your city to help with coverage. There's those sort of things that sometimes pop up that are actually really helpful for me just to keep me on top of certain attributes or things that I need in the city. I think City 2 really heightens the need to keep track of certain things and the radius that they operate within. For example, you may have buildings that apply a boost to your well-being in a certain area. Radio masts, for example, may only work in a certain radius. So you have to be sort of aware of your expansion. And because Cities 2 and how the scaling seems to operate, there's this kind of mass of area that you're going to take up in that urban sprawl. So you have to be on top of advancing your services in that direction or leaning on setting services to operate within certain districts to help cover the whole city that you're building. That sort of leans back in favor of the simulation side of city building. You are going to be required to advance your services as your city expands, maybe plopping down extra buildings, or at least using the modular aspect of the buildings to increase service capacity. Now, one cool thing that you'll probably see throughout the video is opportunities where I can add multiple expansions to one building. For example, I think with the basic clinic for healthcare, I'm able to add multiple additions to that building from a modular standpoint to increase capacity for patients. That may not be the most efficient route to go, but it does give you that opportunity for some sort of expansion before you then go add another clinic. Now, in terms of the evolution of the city, when you're doing this, you may have to have space to actually make that happen, or you're gonna have to delete some buildings, get rid of some zoning, whatever it is to make that expansion. But it is kind of nice to have this opportunity to expand the services of one building instead of putting down like 3 buildings to sort of compensate for the demand. Now, if you've watched my other videos, you know I'm a big fan of the modular buildings. I think this is a really cool feature, and I'm excited to see this implemented in cities too, and more importantly, maybe what it can do for the future. If there are more buildings that are added with this functionality, or if you can add different modular aspects to buildings that already exist in base game cities too. So for example, is there an opportunity where like a DLC or a content creator pack could add wings to a hospital? Or could you add something to like a train station that isn't incorporated in cities too at the base game level? That also goes for maybe the workshop. Is there an opportunity for creators to start creating things that are just modular aspects for buildings that already exist? I'd love to see if that functionality is actually going to be incorporated. Speaking of service expansion, we need to take a look at garbage and power. First and foremost, you can run into a situation where your storage capacity at landfills and stuff like that gets bogged down because your incineration is not operating as quickly as it needs to keep up with how much trash may be in the city. This is pretty self-explanatory, but we can actually go in and add an extra furnace to the incineration plant. Now, the incineration plant also produces a little bit of power for the city, but we also need to probably look at our power situation. I think I'm going to go ahead and unlock a gas power plant, which is going to produce significantly more power than what we already have in the city with the power plant that's currently installed. And we have 2 of them already. Now, one gas power plant will actually produce something like 250 megawatts of power versus the small coal power plants, which only produce about 20 or 25 megawatts, I think. So what I'm thinking I'm going to do is I'm going to place this gas power plant. That'll basically supply power for everything. And then the incineration plant is already there, and we can go ahead and delete the small coal power plants. That way we can reduce spending a little bit and not have 3 power plants operating plus an incineration plant. And then it makes sense because we're going to be producing plenty of power with just the 1 power plant. This is just another example of your city sort of growing and evolving, right? In Cities 1, I often felt a lot of redundancy in terms of some of these buildings. You'd have to incorporate more to keep up with demand of power. Obviously, you could do the upgrades, but something about Cities 2, it just feels a little bit more natural to see this sort of progression. Since our trash storage was backing up, we can also plan to add more storage capacity, more trucks and things like that to increase efficiency and hopefully handle our trash incineration a little bit more smoothly. In retrospect, I probably should have planned our landfill to not be sort of landlocked as it is. I mean, I could delete some zoning and probably expand that area that the landfill takes up, but we can also open up some more expansion slots to some of our other buildings to hopefully take some of the pressure off the landfill. And while we're working on this part of town, let's go ahead and take a look at forestry. We haven't done a ton of specialized industries. At the end of the last episode, I added a couple of different things just north of this area that you're looking at now in terms of like farms, livestock. Haven't really developed that area any more than that. So I want to take a look at least logging forestry and see what that sort of operates as. So we're going to mark this area where we have some land that seems to be perfect for this, and we're going to see how it goes. Now, Cities 2 is going to give you a bunch of information around what resources are available on the map, including what is available, what's the renewal rate and utilization rate of those resources. Because companies in your city are going to utilize these resources to create products, you also can run up a deficit of that product that has to be imported or pulled from these specialized industries. As we zoom out, you can see that it's also going to do a little bit of an aesthetic change. You're going to have a little bit of a texture on the ground, much like the other specialized industries. For forestry, it just seems to be a little bit of a brown texture. If you zoom in, you'll also see logging trucks running through the area. Now, we also have another natural resource that's nearby that we could go ahead and start pulling from, and that would be oil. When I'm hovering over, you can see the deficit of oil we have in the city. And I guess that would be important if you're trying to scale things a certain way to accommodate that deficit or try to find some balance. Now, remember, when you are placing your specialized industry, you always have to pick the zone that it's going to go into, which again is going to give you a texture. I'm not as excited about the textures and how those work along with the auto-populated buildings. I would prefer that have a little bit more control for us to lean on. You're going to get some like rigs in here and stuff like that will auto-populate eventually in that kind of grayed out textured area. For the main building for these specialized industries, you want to keep in mind that those buildings also have radiuses that your zones have to be inside of. So you may want to factor that in when placing them. Now, one thing I will say about the forestry side of stuff is that the forestry and the way it blends in with the forest that's already there is kind of nice. Like you could plant a bunch of trees there potentially, and then have a forestry that blends much better with the map versus having trees that you had to place down inside of a building like in Cities 1, especially with Industries DLC. I didn't love how restricted that looked. Whereas this can kind of blend in with just whatever your surroundings are, and you can place it in a specific area, and it's actually going to feel a little bit more natural. Now, something that we unlocked via development points that we can now add to the city is a university, which is another tier of education in the city. Now, one issue I've seen is that the high schools aren't really getting populated, whereas elementary schools and colleges are doing pretty good, but university comes under a completely different category than the college. Now, I wish we had some of the DLC elements we got with Cities 1, where we were able to build out a whole college campus with multiple buildings and create an area versus just one ploppable building that you could modularly upgrade. This sort of makes me wonder what sort of opportunities there are with regards to DLCs or content creator packs, because I do miss the campus feel. This building is nice and you can upgrade it, but it does not come close to being able to build out like a whole city area or a town within a town. You could use some large sports parks and some zoning to maybe create that feel, but it won't really come close to what we've had in the past. Although it has been an adjustment to see such large buildings coming from base game Cities 2, because I'm not accustomed to that. I mean, we often got buildings that felt very undersized for the scaling that was used across the game. And now we have buildings that feel much more appropriate for what they're meant to be in terms of the aesthetic and scaling. Now, we've made a ton of progress here, and we've hit our 10th milestone being small city, giving us a little more cash, more development points, and plenty of expansion points. We've really made a ton of progress, and we've really set up our city for a much different future. If you remember at the beginning of the episode, we had basically no demand for anything other than low density residential and some industry, and now look at our demand meter. Now we can start raising taxes to counter this. I may look at that a little bit later, but for now we're going to continue this rapid expansion to see what happens. And something that comes with a small city milestone is high density offices. So now we get the opportunity to start mixing in offices with some of these high density residential areas and in some of our more compact downtown spaces. Much like what I've learned with some of the high density residential buildings is I want to space these out a little bit and intermix some medium density and some high density commercial in between them, so it doesn't all feel like main big towers. I want some diversity in terms of the building selection. As you can imagine, it won't take long for these buildings to start to develop, and you can already see what they're going to offer our skyline. So with that, I want to continue to expand our downtown. I want it to take up not only the island we've placed in between where I see our city growing, but I also want to go over to the next coastline. In fact, I feel like this is where I should have probably expanded some of the city elements earlier in our other videos, but for now, this will help us continue to grow the city, and I want to see what this starts to develop and look like later in game of building a city in Cities 2. Now, something that I've looked back on a little bit and I've noticed based on the progress that we've made is that the city still feels a little bit disjointed. And that's just going to take some time for me, I think, to figure out how to apply some of the tools and how Cities 2 works in effort to make the city feel a little bit more cohesive. It's more than just networking and having roads in place to get people from one spot to the other, but it's a little bit more of an aesthetic thing for me. It feels a little bit separated. There's not the areas that I want that sort of combine certain parts. And some of that's because I didn't take elevation into account in every aspect of the area that we were building. Like the industry is sitting up higher, which is fine, and it helps with the wind, but I kind of wish that whole area was a little bit closer to being flat. Not necessarily flat across the board, but less of a significant hill maybe, so things could blend a little bit better. But these are all things I think that I'm going to take into account when I start the next build. And I think we'll be starting a new city once the game releases. I really want to dive into something and kind of start from scratch and start building with a lot that I know, because there has been several things that I feel much more comfortable with. I mean, I understand the road tools better. We have contour lines now, so it'll be a little bit easier for me to get the terrain where I want it early on. Additionally, I understand what's going to pop up in different zones. Now, I've taken some time off camera to tailor the shoreline a little bit to add a harbor. We're going to see what this looks like, and this is something that I've unlocked via development points, but I want to place it here on our shoreline. I know this is a little bit away from our industrial area, but I think it might fit here. Now, there are some modular aspects to this building that are going to cause some issues a little bit later, potentially, if I want to run, for example, a train line to it. Given the sort of area surrounding it, might be a little difficult to get that to fit. But something I do like is that this building is massive, which, you know, we've talked about a lot. The scaling feels much better than Cities 1. I do also like how you tie in your shipping lanes to this building. I think this is a very intuitive process. It feels very smooth and operates pretty nice. Now, something I do like is that I can tailor the sort of terrain around the building. So you see where this cutout is in the building shape. I can actually make adjustments to the terrain utilizing the terrain tools so that it fits a little bit better. Additionally, one thing to keep in mind is when you get your hands on cities too, that some of these massive buildings require multiple areas for roads to connect. So you can see if you look at the corner of the building, I'm getting an indicator saying that it needs road access. That's just something to keep in mind when you're laying these buildings out or planning your roads around these buildings. Now for seaways, which are basically your shipping lanes, you can have 3 different scales. So I guess if you're going through a river or something a little bit more narrow, you can sort of control the size of that or how spread out the ships may get. But I love how easy this feels and how simple it is to set up. I think this is really, really cool and intuitive, and anybody should be able to pick this up pretty quickly. Now, something I talked about in the last video was that certain mechanics exist on a little bit of a redundant basis. So if you've done some of the transportation services already, you're going to have a pretty good indication of how the other ones work. For example, much like your train cargo station, you have to set up a line for cargo to travel to your cargo harbor. Now, I think you can actually expand the capability of the cargo harbor. You can add another crane, so you can put another shipping route in here. We are just going to access these 2, so we're going to have 2 lines running to either side of the map. And once you place those lines in, you're going to have ships utilizing the seaway connectivity that we placed earlier in order to get to the cargo harbor. And you can already see trucks filing in to drop goods off at the harbor because there is a storage capacity that the harbor has, I guess, to distribute it between the ships. Now we've got cargo ships coming in. I want to go ahead and set up a passenger terminal. Now I'm going to go ahead and place this here, and we'll be redoing some of our road connectivity a little bit later because this is kind of a mess, but I didn't place everything exactly where I expected to initially, and I'm having to make adjustments a little bit on the fly to accommodate how I'm setting things up now. And something I noticed that based on where I've placed this passenger station, it's automatically tied itself into the seaway that I've already set up for the cargo harbor, which is pretty cool. So the last thing we need to do is just set up a line so that passenger ships can make it to the station. We also need to ensure that there's some traffic flow between the city and the harbor itself. And I admit that my roads are now becoming a little bit more congested, especially as I grow and continue to zone. We obviously did a lot of 2-lane roads in downtown areas, branching off of some of our bigger avenues, and I'm starting to see congestion in some of those streets, although some of it seems to be related to the growth, but some of it is a little bit more consistent. In some spots, I've even used some of the road tools to turn off turnings, like left-hand turns and stuff like that, to help with some of the efficiency at intersections, and I'm still waiting to see how beneficial that really is. One area of help we probably need is to actually set up some more interchanges tied to the highways to filter in traffic into different parts of the city. As the city has grown, I haven't really updated this, but now we're going to go ahead and add 2 more interchanges that are in-game base items, and we're going to have those connect to either side of our city, one on the downtown end and one on this newer area where I've started to plan a lot of residential and near the harbors. Now, we've talked a lot about how the roads give you a preview of what you're doing, how they feel intuitive, but I can tell you this, it's a little bit finicky at times, and you have to be really careful how you're placing your mouse cursor over some of the roads, especially when you're combining something like a 2-lane to a 3-lane. The intuitive aspect of the game is that it's going to look for where your cursor is on one side of the road or the other to help determine where your sort of merging areas should be. The adjustments for it are very, very fine. Like, it's going to take a little bit of patience to get it maybe lined up the way you want. You just need to be aware of where your cursor is because the game is looking at that to help identify how the road is moving forward once you connect those. Now, for the most part, we've been able to carry electricity, sewage, and water through a lot of the roads that we've already placed. However, highways don't carry the same piping. So this is one of those instances where you would have to add some sort of pipes or something like that, or electrical lines to connect different parts of your city, especially if they're built from a highway. I will say one of the simplest tools to use in the game is the roundabout tool because it is basically drag and drop, and it automatically sets up your roundabout, which is a very nice feature. Roundabouts weren't something I used a lot of in Cities 1 because it tended to take a little bit of extra time, and it wasn't something that you often see in North American builds, at least the builds I was doing. I set up this area in a couple of tiers because I think there's going to be a few buildings that we can put up on this hill that may have some services or something like that, and then have traffic also flow down into the residential area we've already been setting up. This part of town is really going to be the majority of where we continue to expand low density residential, add some education and other services as just basically a suburb of our larger downtown area. But I am hoping that these interchanges I'm going to add do help filter traffic into other parts of the town because right now they're very reliant on a lot of the infrastructure that exists within downtown because they only have one interchange set up. Now, interchanges in Cities 2 do appear to very much appreciate flat ground or something very close to flat ground. I tried to put an interchange down with some terrain change and it just wasn't really working out. It was giving me an error saying that there was some overlap issue. So just be mindful that you may be required to do some terrain conforming to accommodate something like an interchange. Now, I say that also because we've talked a little bit about some of the overlap issues I've seen and how sensitive the overlap notification can be in the game. The game is really going to try to prevent you from overlapping any sort of main service building, signature building, and stuff like that. Ploppable buildings, basically. It's also going to react a little bit towards your overlapping of roads, whereas zones are pretty much fair game. Speaking of zones, take a look at our demand and how much that has grown over the course of just this video. We've not only expanded our population and grown the city drastically compared to where we started. I mean, we're at what, about 3 times the population we finished the last video with. But we've also corrected our demand meter, and now it seems to be in a position where it may never end. I have noticed though that we're still getting a lot of notifications for a couple things, and I think I've mentioned this before. There are some notifications that are popping up for high rent in certain areas, especially low density residential, and I think that may be a balancing issue that they need to correct, because it seems to be like consistent across the board that you're going to run into this issue at some point. Additionally, commercial buildings are having issues with not enough customers, which I can understand to a degree, but it seems to be a little bit over the top. Again, maybe a balancing thing that Colossal Order has to tweak because it just doesn't quite make sense at the rate that it's happening. But as we progress through the episode, you're going to continue to see these notifications popping up across our city. And it's something myself and I've talked with other creators about because it seems to be occurring across all of our saves to some extent. And that kind of goes back into this idea that Cities 2 seems to want you to continue to evolve different parts of your city, go from low density residential to medium density and so on and so forth. But that also makes it difficult if you're looking to do things like have suburbs and have just low density housing in certain areas, because you want those areas to stay that way, not consistently evolving them into whatever the next density level is. I do think the pace at which I can grow a city in Cities 2 is pretty fast. I mean, we've sort of balanced our budget and we are making money, which is fantastic. And that was something I was a little bit worried about as I progressed through, because there were some instances where I couldn't really put down all the buildings I wanted, given the situation of like recording and trying to follow the more organic path of building a city. So I had to be a little bit careful, but now we have some money to play with and we are gaining cash. So we'll probably look at some development points here shortly and look to see what we can build and add to the city and some unique buildings. Not to mention, we could also probably raise our taxes, which would slow down demand a little bit and also bring in a little bit more funds so that we can continue our wild expansion. Something I haven't talked about much has been pedestrian paths. We highlighted them briefly in the first episode of Early Access, just to show you sort of what they looked like. And I'm a little bit mixed on my opinion of them, because on one hand, they do seem like something that's a little bit more rigid to place. Like it's not sort of like painting where the magnetic aspect of the paths you have in Cities 1 are going to cause a lot of issues. However, they are a little bit too rigid in my opinion. On one hand, it's easy to connect them to the side of the road, but if you're not careful, you can end up in situations where when you are connecting them to the road, it'll sort of automatically put it at an angle versus a straight line, and you can't really correct that. Now, it's nice that it sort of automatically sets up your connection to the road, and you can even add a crosswalk based on how you're placing the pedestrian path. But I just wish that we were able to make some sort of adjustment at that connection point between the pedestrian path and the road itself. You can see that little spot there, that small segment is slightly angled on both of these segments. Now, let's say that there's a slight height adjustment there from the road down, even though I've smoothed it out, I think a little beyond the road. I've seen this in multiple situations where I'm trying to do small parks in the middle of downtown, where I'm getting kind of like awkward connection points on the pedestrian paths to the point that I'm just not really sure how I want to go about that yet. And this is doing straight lines between roads to fill in spaces between buildings that really aren't suited for buildings. I feel like these pedestrian paths are really suited very well to do very geometric shaped pathing in parks. It may just take some getting used to figure out how to work out those connection points to roads and other things. Speaking of other things, I do wish that we could connect these paths to some of the ploppable buildings that we have. And you'll see that here momentarily when we get to some of the construction I want to do near here around the college and university campuses. Now, I'm setting this up as sort of a little nature park that you can kind of take a walk in, and Sims can relax and walk around, get some exercise in, whatever they prefer. So I'm going to do some organic lines off of the road. We'll also add a pedestrian bridge nearby just to give a good look at how some of the pedestrian bridges operate. Doing this also makes me miss being able to paint an area for a park. I'll have to keep an eye on this area to see if this adds any sort of value or if Sims even utilize the pedestrian pathing. And something I wasn't really expecting is that when I'm starting to place these, we're obviously on a slope. And to a degree, these act like the networks you have for roads, right? And utilizing them on certain terrain changes or hills, you might actually get retaining walls on the pedestrian paths, which are kind of interesting. Now that we have our pathing down in this organic way, I'm going to go ahead and add some trees. And man, do I miss forest brush. That was one of my favorite kind of sneaky mods that you could have in Cities 1, and I do wish that this was integrated a little bit more into Cities 2. While we do have the brush and we can select the trees that we want to utilize, I would love to be able to select multiple trees, bushes, and things like that to add in. Placing individual trees and bushes can be fine in certain situations, but it does feel a little bit of a slower process for some reason in Cities 2. Some of that just may be me being so accustomed to using something like prop line tool to draw a line of bushes just to speed up a little bit of the detailing process. I really like that we have some options for the pedestrian bridges, including a covered pedestrian bridge. These were often underutilized for me in Cities 1, so I'm excited to be able to incorporate these a little bit more moving forward. We also have variations of the pedestrian bridges, so you can actually intermix these if you would like. If you want a covered walkway up to the bridge and then you want to piece something else in, you can do that. I think there's a couple things that I also like about the pedestrian paths, and that is that they're more narrow in this versus Cities 1, and the bridges also feel like something that I might utilize a little bit more frequently in my builds, which was often something I underutilized, I would say, in Cities 1. So I could see myself leaning on some of these items a little bit more in certain situations when I find them appropriate. There's a lot of things I found in Cities 2 as I dive deeper and deeper into the gameplay that I feel like are going to have me change a little bit of my building style to better incorporate. You know, it could be as simple as, you know, adding more pedestrian paths because they tend to look better, in my opinion, in Cities 2 than in Cities 1. But there's more than just that. I mean, all the different zoning types and stuff are going to force me to sort of alter how I look at things. And granted, I was someone that leaned heavily on workshop assets, and I don't expect all of that kind of stuff to be available at the, you know, forefront. We're sort of leaving a massive library behind, but I do think that there's many features in Cities 2 that are going to have me sort of alter the way I play and the way I look at the game, and hopefully I can kind of figure that out and get a more polished feel for how I want to set things up and how I want to create cities. And I don't think that's really a negative thing. It's just, it's so new, it's so fresh, and there's so many different tools and they work differently, and it's sort of a process of adapting to those new tools and those new things that we have access to. And then we're going to see sort of where things go, because right now I don't feel like the city is very well laid out. I don't really like the way I've set it up and how I've kind of terraformed it. And I think that for the most part, I've been able to make it work with what I'm setting up, but I also feel like there's a big opportunity to have, you know, all the game knowledge I have now versus when I first started this series and really revamp this whole thing. I think one of the biggest things that I'm sort of surprised about, and I think it'll just take some time before it catches up, is that Cities 2 doesn't feel as friendly with detail. And I know that's not the end all for everybody, but that was something that myself and many of my peers leaned on, was the ability to detail rather quickly. And I realize I may be factoring in some mod support for that, you know, and we've talked a little bit about that in some of these episodes, but I do hope that we can see some improvements in trying to make detailing a little bit more approachable for those that want to dive a little bit deeper into sort of customizing areas and making things look unique to their city. And it's not that it's hard to detail, it just feels a little bit more time consuming and draining because you can only place single trees, or you have a brush mode, but it doesn't fill in like something like forest brush. Even just being able to select multiple trees for that would be great. So we've made a pretty good effort at getting demand back up and really expanding our city. We could probably go bananas, but for now, I think we've done some pretty good work at making some progress and growing the city at a pretty rapid rate. Now we're going to hit our big city milestone, which is going to unlock more development points, expansion points, and some more cash put into our economy. It's also going to extend our loan limit, but we haven't really needed that. Now there's no real additional unlocks for the big city milestone. I think we've pretty much unlocked everything besides just adding more of what we already have. But what we're going to be moving forward and doing is utilizing some of these development points we've stacked up to unlock some more buildings and check out what's available. We're going to start with the post-sorting facility, which is going to help and expand our capability when it comes to mail. And we're going to tuck this up here in this area where I thought I might add some offices and things up above some of the new parts of town we've recently zoned. This is another ploppable building that feels pretty big for its size, and I'm again pretty happy and pleased with that. I would love to integrate these better into the city as we move forward, and I think as we start to fill up this side of the town, it'll look a little bit better and not so isolated. And much like many of the other buildings we've placed in this manner, you still do have modular aspects to the buildings to expand capability and the volume that it can handle. which you can tell by the expansion we've made with this episode alone. There's been times where I've had to go back and upgrade capability on different service buildings to keep up with demand. So the next building we're going to look at is something that I hadn't even really thought of placing until more recently, and it just kind of caught my attention when I was looking through the development points, and that is a server farm. I wasn't even sure what the building necessarily did. I thought maybe it was just going to increase efficiency of the internet or something like that, but it seems to almost help provide network capability. So we need to place this a little more centralized with a large portion of our population. So I'm going to place this at the edge of our industrial area, which is close to a lot of where our suburb is, and then hopefully they'll enjoy the better internet connectivity. So next up, we're going to unlock the fire station, which is going to have a much larger capacity to help in the city, which is probably pretty important considering we really haven't been doing many service upgrades like this. And we're going to place it probably where we have the most need, which is on this new part of downtown near our hospital. As we've come to expect, the modular aspects of this building continue to provide unique services or additions to the services that they offer, along with things like efficiency and or capability. We'll go ahead and tie this to certain districts on this side of the city to help take some of the burden off some of the smaller fire departments we have throughout. Now, the next thing we're going to do is a little bit more of a project. We're going to unlock the technical university, and we're going to be adding that here near our university. So I talked a little bit earlier about how colleges didn't feel as robust as they did, especially with the campus DLCs in Cities 1. But what I started to think is with some of the education buildings that are in some of the development points that you can spend, you might be able to create a little bit of a campus because some of these buildings are pretty big. They do have the campus look with sort of the quads and a lot of the pedestrian paths. So I'm going to see if I can use some of these buildings to create something that looks closer to a campus. And something that I noticed is that the technical university actually boosts efficiency for zones that are industry and office space. So despite having laid out this area as a nice cozy neighborhood, I'm actually going to be removing a large chunk of this, and we're going to see if we can move some of the sports fields in to create a little bit more of a campus look. I do wish we still had some stadiums and things like that, but I think with some pedestrian paths and some of the other modular aspects of the university, we can create an area here that looks a little bit more like a campus. In terms of the modular building aspects of the university, we get a couple of things. The expansion point only actually extends the building itself. So we're going to use the library and this park area to give us a little bit more of a presence. I've already moved the football field and added some parking, so we have a little bit of a sports complex going on. There's obviously a soccer field we could also place here. Then with some pedestrian paths, I think we can integrate it all together. Now, something that I noticed is that when I draw this first path in the back of the library, it actually extends the pavement area of the library. And I thought that was kind of interesting. I don't know if that's some sort of bug or if that's supposed to happen, but if we could see more of that, I'd be really stoked because I think that is a very helpful way of sort of blending your pedestrian paths in with some of the buildings. Because as I've talked about, that is limited right now. You kind of have to make it look like it's connected because as you can see at the back of the university, we still have a rounded edge, and I'm just going to draw this along what comes with the university to make it seem like folks can just walk right onto the pedestrian path. But otherwise, I'm going to make this area just into a little bit of a quad. So we're going to do some very geometric shapes here, something typical in North American universities. That'll connect a lot of the school buildings to the sports area. And then on the end here, we have the technical university, which looks drastically different, but I do feel like because we've added some of these quads and things like that, it helps blend it in a little bit better. Not to mention, we also have a college nearby to help kind of add to the buildings that we need for our university to look more like a campus. But we're going to go ahead and unlock the med school. The med school is actually going to give us a new signature building for Pharma, which is something we can add to this area as well or nearby. And since I've had the chance to place this building, I realized it does not fit the campus look that I was going for. It's much larger than I expected, and there is plenty of expansion to do to make this building much more robust. However, it does provide some helpful efficiencies for our healthcare in the city, which is always good. So you can see that these universities not only provide access for students, but they give some sort of efficiency for the rest of the city. So there are multiple benefits to having them. Now, placing the Pharma signature building, you can tell it's under the industry category. So let's see what it offers the city. It looks like it's going to help efficiency for industry, interest in university education, and university graduation chance. And from the simulation side, I thought this was interesting that it is a building that is empty and available for rent by a company. It doesn't come pre-stocked with a company, which is kind of a cool feature. Now you can see there's multiple different industry signature buildings that are going to help in some capacity with your city. This goes for just about every category of signature building, and I think this is a cool way of making signature buildings much more valuable to have in your city, along with having sort of goals to get them. We're gonna go and add the base level airport into our city build, and I'm gonna place this on the opposite end of the city, closer to the downtown area. We're gonna build it close to some infrastructure that's already in place, just to take a look at it and see how it operates. Now, I realize there's also the international airport, which is something we could place later or upgrade to eventually. I know that is a much larger building though, but for now, I think this will do. We're also going to do some basic infrastructure to the airport, nothing fancy, and we'll add some parking and stuff to kind of make this feel a little bit more like it fits the part. Much like the other transportation services we've added, you do have to set up lines for passenger planes to land, and those can be specific to the terminal. So you have multiple terminals that you can create routes on, which I thought was kind of an interesting take on how to set up your airport. Now you can see we're currently running at a deficit. That's not strictly because of the airport, but there was an update to the game, the version that I have, which may actually kind of mess with some of the balancing. So I've got to take a deeper look at that to see what all changed. Now, to some degree with the airports, I do miss a little bit of the airport DLC. I actually thought that some of the airport DLC functionality was going to be incorporated in Cities 2, not just strictly for airports, but I thought the ability to draw networks of buildings was actually really cool, and I kind of expected to see that in Cities 2. Maybe like shopping centers could be drawn out using networks that would then be buildings, but as of right now, I don't see that functionality currently added. But I do wonder if we'll see something like that in the future. Now, something I said I was going to talk a little bit more about was the economy, and I took this clip after the update that came out for Cities 2, so you may not see everything the way I saw them prior to the update. So I'm still adjusting accordingly, but this is sort of what you're going to get from the economy side. You can see there's a ton of production elements, there's a ton of services. Your taxes are broken down based off industry and office sort of specialization in terms of what those companies are doing. Same for commercial. There's a lot here to balance if you choose to. I don't know that you have to go so in depth with it, but to some degree, I think Cities 2 does push you to be a little bit more focused on the economy and what's all going on in the city, which is pretty interesting. I mean, when you break it down in terms of materials and material goods and immaterial goods, and then you have all these services running and different businesses leaning on certain production pieces being in place, there's a lot going on. Now, while Cities 2 is of course a cities builder, there is some resource management in some way that sim folks can dive into. You may have the capability of really creating multiple towns or cities that rely on each other for a lot of these goods, which is kind of neat, especially considering how large the map is and the fact that you can buy tiles and areas and spread out your builds. That's pretty cool. That gives you a much more robust city builder, because then you're building a region versus just a city. Which kind of leads me to my overall impressions of where I've gotten with Cities 2 so far in this early access version. Now, something that I've said in the last 2 episodes that I'll continue to say today, Cities 2 is not just a continuation of Cities 1. We are in a different world here because this is a much different platform that we're building off of. It in some ways is much more robust. It feels like a significantly improved foundation in terms of the information that Cities 2 is handling and processing, decision making behind the scenes, which lends itself to be much more of a living and breathing thing when you start to build a city. The interconnectivity of businesses, companies, goods, and services all sort of needing each other and working in a connected manner really brings these cities to life as you build them. But with any living thing, it does require stuff. It does have needs. And with that, you are going to find yourself having to manage a little bit more of your city from a simulation side. I would say the economy and some of the things you have to tackle from that side could be a little bit more demanding than some would expect. With that said, I don't think you're going to have to spend all of your time doing those sort of things, but there is a certain amount of focus you need, especially to make the city sort of grow in the way that you may want. Despite having kept up with the dev diaries and a lot of the information Colossal Order provided around what was expected in Cities 2, I am sort of surprised at how much is really there, despite having played it a little while now. Now, I don't want to scare anybody off and make it seem like it's a resource management game, because I don't really think it is. It is still a city builder at heart. And I do love a lot of the base game options we have to build cities. I mean, the different zone types are really fun to play with. In addition to that, once you have a better understanding of what buildings may pop up based on zone sizes, you can continue to create a variety in terms of what exists within your city or skyline. For the most part, during recording this episode, I found a lot of reactivity to what I was placing in terms of zones, what I did with taxes, making the game feel very integrated and understanding of different changes you could make to influence certain things in your city. So I'm pretty stoked that we made the progress that we did by making adjustments to taxes and trying to incentivize higher education while placing those buildings. I think there's a lot of fun to be had with messing around with different figures to create cities that people are really looking to create. Additionally, creating different cities in the same region So when you load a map and creating two cities that rely off each other based on how some of the services and production works, I think is going to be a really fun challenge. And it's not even something that I've really touched on yet or played with at all. And finally, I've had a lot of fun playing with some of the signature buildings and some of the things that you can plop down, playing with some of the modular aspects of those to help compensate when needing higher efficiency or just more service capability. There are certainly features and mechanics that I hope to see in the future of Cities 2, but I do think that this new platform that Cities 2 is built off of is significantly more robust than what we had, and it's going to take some adjusting. But ultimately, I think it was necessary to be able to give us more functionality and more control over the city building process. And if you've made it this far, I really appreciate you guys and the support you've given through the early access videos of City Skylines 2. So if you haven't already, be sure to hit the subscribe button, leave a like, and drop a comment down below, and I'll try to answer what I can if it is a question. But that's it for now. Thanks for watching, and take care.